The air was crisp as I hiked through the dense forest, the scent of pine and damp earth surrounding me. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long golden rays through the canopy above. I had set out early that morning, eager for a weekend of solitude at my usual campsite, a remote clearing by a small, tranquil lake. The thought of roasting a fresh catch over an open fire and sleeping under the stars had kept me motivated through the long work week. But I never expected the journey to be one of survival. With my backpack secured and my hunting knife strapped to my belt, I walked with confident strides. The trail was familiar, yet every visit seemed to unveil something new. A fallen tree, an unusual cluster of mushrooms, or an animal print pressed into the dirt. I kept my eyes sharp, scanning for any signs of movement. It was the wilderness after all, and I knew better than to let my guard down completely. The rustling in the underbrush was soft at first, barely noticeable above the sounds of birds and the occasional creak of branches in the wind. I stopped, listening, my breath shallow. My pulse quickened slightly, though I reassured myself it was likely just a squirrel or a raccoon rummaging through the foliage. But then, a low growl cut through the air. A chill ran down my spine. I turned slowly, scanning the dimming forest for the source of the sound. My hand instinctively moved to the hilt of my knife. And then I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes reflecting the last light of the day. The sleek, muscular body of a bobcat was crouched low in the brush, its ears flattened, tail flicking ominously. Bobcats were typically elusive, preferring to avoid human encounters. This one, however, was different. Something about its posture, the way its lips curled back to reveal sharp teeth, told me it saw me as prey. I took a slow step back, maintaining eye contact. I knew that sudden movements could trigger an attack. "Easy now," I murmured, though my voice barely carried over the distance between us. My heart pounded as I calculated my options. Running was out of the question. It would only provoke a chase, and bobcats were agile, built for short bursts of speed. Climbing wasn't an option either. It could scale trees better than I could. Before I could think of another plan, it lunged. Time seemed to slow as I reacted on instinct. I sidestepped, but not quickly enough. Claws raked across my left forearm, tearing through my jacket and drawing blood. Pain flared up my arm, sharp and searing, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. The bobcat landed gracefully, pivoting to strike again. I drew my knife in a swift motion, gripping it tightly. As the animal sprang toward me a second time, I twisted my body and swung my blade upward. The knife met its mark, slicing into the bobcat's side. A pained yowl echoed through the trees, but the creature wasn't finished yet. It clawed at my leg, its frenzied attack driven by either hunger or desperation. My vision blurred for a moment as pain shot up through my thigh. Adrenaline surged through me, overriding everything else. I drove the knife forward, aiming for the throat. It was a desperate, primal movement, one I hadn't planned but executed out of sheer survival instinct. The blade found its target, sinking deep. The bobcat let out a final guttural cry before it collapsed, its body twitching before going still. I stood over it, panting, my body trembling with a mix of shock and exertion. The world around me seemed eerily silent, as if nature itself had paused to acknowledge the battle that had just taken place. Blood, mine and the bobcat's, stained the ground. My injuries were painful, but they weren't fatal. Still, I knew better than to ignore the risk of infection or worse, rabies. Bobcats weren't common carriers, but any wild animal bite was a potential risk. I needed medical attention, and soon. With a deep breath, I retrieved my water bottle and poured some over my wounds, gritting my teeth as the cold liquid met raw flesh. I tore a strip from my undershirt and wrapped it tightly around my arm, then did the same for my leg. The bleeding had slowed, but my body still ached with every step. I considered abandoning my trip entirely, heading straight back to my truck and driving to the nearest town. But the thought of trekking back in the dark, especially in my condition, was unappealing. Instead, I decided to make it to my campsite, rest for the night, and assess my condition in the morning. When I finally arrived at the clearing, I wasted no time setting up camp. The fire crackled to life under my shaking hands, its warmth a small comfort against the ordeal I had just survived. I kept my knife close as I ate a small meal, my body too exhausted to feel hunger, but knowing I needed sustenance. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside my tent put me on edge. My mind replayed the attack, the moment the bobcat's eyes locked onto mine, the feel of its claws tearing through fabric and flesh. At first light, I packed up and started my slow journey back. The pain in my arm and leg had worsened overnight, and I knew I couldn't delay medical attention any longer. When I finally reached my truck, relief washed over me. I drove straight to the nearest clinic, explaining what had happened to a skeptical yet concerned doctor. After cleaning and stitching my wounds, they administered a rabies shot. Better safe than sorry, the nurse had said, offering me a reassuring smile. The reality of how close I had come to something far worse finally settled in. As I sat in that clinic, my body sore and my mind still reeling, I realized something. Nature wasn't just a place for peace and solitude. It was raw, unpredictable, and at times merciless. And yet I knew this wouldn't be my last trip. If anything, the encounter had only deepened my respect for the wilderness, and my understanding that out here, you had to be prepared for anything. Next time, I'd be ready. The desert night was silent, save for the crackling of my fire. The embers flickered, casting eerie shadows against the towering saguaro cacti. I exhaled deeply, the scent of charred wood mixing with the crisp desert air. I had camped alone before, but something about this night felt off. Then the howling began. At first, it was distant, just a single drawn-out wail carried by the wind. But soon more voices joined in, a chorus of mournful cries echoing through the canyon. My grip tightened around the machete resting in my lap. Coyotes. I'd heard them the night before, but they had kept their distance. This time the howls were closer, much closer. My fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the darkness. I reached for another log and fed the flames, hoping the light would keep them away. But the howls didn't fade. They grew bolder, circling, stalking. A sudden rustle from the bushes behind my tent sent my heart into overdrive. I whirled around, machete raised. My eyes strained against the dark, searching for movement. Then a low, guttural growl. It was right there. A pair of glowing eyes reflected the firelight, hovering just above the ground. The creature crept forward, its tawny fur blending seamlessly with the dirt and brush. It was larger than any coyote I'd ever seen, its muscles taut beneath its coat, saliva dripping from its bared fangs. I stepped back, the machete shaking slightly in my grasp. The coyote's ears flattened. It snarled. Then it lunged. I barely had time to react. I swung the machete wildly, the blade slicing through the air. The coyote dodged, its reflexes unnervingly quick. I grabbed a burning log from the fire and thrust it forward. The flames roared as the creature recoiled, its eyes flashing with fury. Snarling, it paced, calculating its next move. My mind raced. If there was one, there were more. And if they were desperate enough to attack me directly, they weren't going to give up easily. The howls from the distance closed in. Another set of eyes appeared beyond the fire's glow, then another. The pack had arrived. I swung the burning log in an arc, keeping them at bay. My only chance was to make a stand here. If I ran, I was dead. The leader feinted, snapping at my leg before darting back. It was testing me, trying to wear me down. I had to strike first. I lunged with the machete, slashing at the beast's shoulder. A yelp split the night as it staggered back, blood staining its fur. The others hesitated, uncertain now. Adrenaline surged through my veins. I grabbed another flaming log and hurled it into the brush. It exploded into a burst of embers and smoke. The coyotes yelped, scattering back into the darkness. The leader growled once more, its gaze locking with mine. Hatred, primal and seething, burned in its eyes. But then, as quickly as they had appeared, they vanished. I stood there, breath heaving, muscles locked in anticipation. The night was silent again, save for the crackle of my fire. My hands trembled as I wiped blood, mine or the coyotes', I wasn't sure, onto my pants. They would be back. I wasn't staying to find out when. The Florida woods felt different that evening. The air was heavy with the lingering heat of the day, but the usual hum of life, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, was strangely absent. It was the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Bailey trotted a few steps ahead of me, her ears perked, tail high, sniffing the ground with her usual curiosity. I adjusted my grip on my walking stick, a sturdy hand-carved staff I had shaped myself, worn smooth from years of use. At my belt, my small knife rested in its sheath, a tool I always carried but had never needed for more than cutting rope or slicing fruit. I should have turned back then. Bailey froze, her muscles tensed, her body lowering slightly in a defensive stance. A low growl rumbled in her throat. I stopped walking. "Bailey?" My voice was barely above a whisper. Then I saw it. A coyote stood at the edge of the trail, half hidden in the underbrush. It wasn't like the scrawny, skittish coyotes I'd seen in the past. This one was bigger, its coat rough and mottled, ribs faintly visible beneath its fur. Its yellow eyes glowed in the fading light, locked onto Bailey with an unsettling hunger. My pulse slammed against my ribs. I knew better than to turn and run. That would only trigger a predator's instinct to chase. Instead, I planted my feet, gripping my walking stick tighter. Bailey let out a sharp bark, her body rigid with tension. The coyote didn't flinch. Instead, it lowered its head and stepped forward, muscles coiled like a loaded spring. Something was wrong. Coyotes didn't usually act like this. They were opportunistic scavengers, not bold hunters. But this one wasn't backing down. A second movement flickered in the trees. I inhaled sharply. Another coyote. This one slinked through the brush to my left, circling. I realized with a sickening certainty that the first coyote was distracting us while the second moved in. They were hunting. Bailey barked again, louder this time, her stance shifting between defensive and aggressive. The first coyote took another step forward, lips curling back to reveal sharp teeth. I had to act. Raising my walking stick high above my head, I roared, not yelled, roared from deep in my chest. I slammed the staff against a tree with all my strength. The crack echoed through the forest like a gunshot. The second coyote hesitated, but the first one, he didn't flinch. He stepped closer. Bailey snapped her teeth, lunging forward just enough to make the coyote stop. I seized the moment. My hand flew to my belt, pulling out my knife. The cool metal felt reassuring in my grip, but I knew I didn't want this fight to get that close. I took a step forward, swinging the stick wildly, shouting at the top of my lungs. I wasn't just trying to scare them, I was daring them. For a long, terrifying second, neither coyote moved. Then, something shifted. Maybe they decided I wasn't worth the risk. Maybe they were waiting for an easier meal. Either way, the first coyote finally flicked its ears, let out a low, almost disappointed huff, and slunk back into the shadows. The second one followed, their glowing eyes lingering for just a heartbeat before vanishing into the brush. I didn't move. Not for a few long seconds, until my pounding heart slowed just enough to think clearly again. Bailey whined softly, pressing against my leg. I ran a shaky hand over her head. "Let's get out of here, girl." This time I didn't just hike back. I moved fast, constantly checking over my shoulder. The woods felt darker, heavier. I could still feel those yellow eyes on us, watching from the shadows, waiting. That night, as I sat on my porch with Bailey curled up beside me, I kept my walking stick within arm's reach. I had faced coyotes before, but never like that, never as prey. And I knew one thing for sure. We had gotten lucky. The forest was alive with the usual symphony of nighttime sounds, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. I had always loved camping alone. There was something deeply satisfying about being self-reliant, about finding peace in the raw, untamed beauty of nature. That night, everything felt normal, perfect even. I had set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines, their branches swaying gently in the cool evening air. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm golden glow that pushed back the encroaching darkness. I sat on a log, sipping hot cocoa from a tin mug, the steam curling up into the crisp night. The stars were out in full force, their light piercing through the canopy like tiny diamonds. It was peaceful, quiet, exactly what I had come for. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have this place all to myself. No distractions, no noise, just me and the wilderness. I poked at the fire with a stick, sending a cascade of sparks spiraling into the air. The flames danced hypnotically, and I felt myself relax, the stresses of the week melting away. I even hummed a little tune, my voice soft and barely audible over the crackling of the fire. The forest felt familiar, safe. I'd been camping dozens of times before, and nothing bad had ever happened. Sure, there were the usual sounds, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, but that was just the forest being the forest. Animals going about their business. Nothing to worry about. I decided to turn in early. The hike in had been long, and I was tired. I doused the fire carefully, making sure the embers were completely out, and crawled into my tent. The sleeping bag was warm and inviting, and I zipped it up to my chin, listening to the soothing sounds of the night. The wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere far off, an owl hooted again. I closed my eyes, feeling completely at ease. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate in my chest. My eyes snapped open, and I lay perfectly still, straining to hear over the sudden pounding of my heart. The growl came again, closer this time, and I felt a chill crawl down my spine. It wasn't the sound of a deer or a raccoon. It was something bigger, something predatory. I sat up slowly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Maybe it was a bear? No, the growl was different, sharper, more deliberate. My hand fumbled for the flashlight I kept by my sleeping bag, but before I could turn it on, I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps just outside my tent. My blood turned to ice. I froze, my fingers tightening around the flashlight. The footsteps circled the tent, slow and deliberate, and I could hear the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. Whatever it was big, and it was close. Then the growl came again, right outside the thin fabric of my tent. This time it was accompanied by the sound of sniffing, deep and wet, as if whatever was out there was trying to catch my scent. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure it could hear it. I clutched the flashlight like a weapon, my mind racing. What should I do? Stay quiet? Make noise? My thoughts were a jumbled mess, but one thing was clear. I couldn't just lie there and wait for it to come in. I reached for the bear spray I always kept clipped to the inside of my tent. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the safety clip off. The growling stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then, with a sudden, terrifying force, something slammed into the side of the tent. I screamed, scrambling backward as the fabric bowed inward, the poles groaning under the pressure. The growl turned into a snarl, and I could see the outline of a massive shape pressing against the tent wall. My flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled away, casting wild shadows as it moved. I fumbled with the bear spray, my fingers slick with sweat, and finally managed to get it aimed just as the tent zipper started to move. The wolf's head appeared first, its glowing golden eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach drop. It was huge, bigger than any wolf I'd ever seen, with a thick, shaggy black coat that seemed to absorb the light. Its lips were curled back in a snarl, revealing teeth that looked like they could tear through flesh with ease. I didn't think, I just acted. I squeezed the trigger on the bear spray, and a cloud of orange mist erupted between us. The wolf let out a piercing yelp and jerked back, shaking its head and pawing at its eyes. But it didn't run. It turned back to me, snarling, its eyes blazing with fury. I sprayed again, this time holding the trigger down, the canister hissing as it emptied. The wolf howled in pain and finally retreated, disappearing into the shadows with a final, haunting growl. I sat there, trembling, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. The tent was a mess. One side partially collapsed, and my sleeping bag was tangled around my legs. My arms and legs were scratched and bleeding from where I'd scrambled backward, but I barely felt the pain. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the corner of the tent, clutching the empty bear spray canister like a lifeline, my eyes fixed on the torn fabric where the wolf had tried to get in. Every sound outside made me jump, my heart racing as I scanned the darkness for any sign of movement. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, my hands still shaking. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less menacing, but no less alive. As I hiked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump, my heart racing as I scanned the trees for glowing golden eyes. I made it home safely, but the experience stayed with me. I still love the wilderness, but I've never gone camping alone again. And every time I hear a wolf howl in the distance, I feel that same chill run down my spine, a reminder of the night everything seemed normal until it wasn't.